Afternoon, everybody. It's great to see how much the REs are doing across the country, and happy to have this opportunity to spend about 20-25 minutes with you, giving you the perspective from PJM before we turn it over to my colleague over in MISO. If we could go to the next slide, please. What we have here, this is the control room, one of our control rooms. This one is in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It shows you some of the activity that we look at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And as you are aware, the regional grid operators have more mounting challenges that they're dealing with as demand increases and as supply resources become more challenging to harness. You may have heard that 2 weeks ago, we actually hit a new record high peak winter day. Tuesday morning, 2 weeks ago, around 8:15 in the morning. So this control room was a very, very busy place. If you're on this call, you're probably very concerned with load growth, with resource adequacy. And as we all know, the North American bulk power system is facing mounting resource adequacy challenges in light of many of these trends that we're seeing now. Retirement of thermal resources, surging demand predicted over the next 10 years, which we'll discuss, and other announced plans for retirement. But I'm happy to say PJM is working collaboratively with its states, its regulators, its legislators, and fellow regional transmission organizations such as MISO to the west, New York ISO to our north, and the Southern Territory to our south. If we could turn to the next slide, I'll just provide you with a high-level overview of who PJM is, for those of you who don't know. In the lighter shaded blue, you see the Eastern Interconnection, and in the darker shaded blue is PJM's service territory. We serve 13 states plus the District of Columbia. In that small patch, we serve also 1 out of 5 Americans. About 65 million customers reside in the PJM service territory. And we also report up to 2 of the REs, both Reliability First and CERC, Reliability Corporation to our south. Here you just see some of the statistics that govern PJM. We have about 88,000 miles of transmission lines, service territory of about 370,000 square miles. At the top line there, we have actually this number needs to be updated, we have over 1,100 members that are part of PJM. And as many of you know, we are effectively a nonprofit entity that operates the grid. We do not own any generation assets. We do not own any transmission assets either, although we have operational control over the transmission system. In the next slide here, you'll see what NERC has recently announced in their long-term reliability assessment that they provide every year, typically in December. And this map in front of you depicts some of the potential shortfalls in capacity that they're seeing as they look forward many years into the future, both near and far. PJM, as you can see on the East Coast there, is in orange. That means an elevated risk of shortfall may occur during extreme conditions. So that could be extreme weather, typically either in the peaks of the winter or the summer. And just a year ago, we were actually in the blue color. So we have been downgraded by NERC into an elevated situation. And you can see there are dates associated with that as well. 2026, mid-2026 is when we potentially could see some capacity shortfalls on our system. So we're working with our regulator, FERC. We're working with our states as well to address really 4 big challenges, not only facing PJM, but facing the industry at large. The first one is satisfying escalating demand for electricity. And we could talk about some of the drivers and factors increasing load on the system in a moment. We'll talk about managing generator retirements. That's a second very large challenge that we're dealing with. And the third and fourth challenges are developing sufficient generating resources and developing sufficient transmission infrastructure to move that power to market. In this next slide here, you'll see our trends for demand growth. This was the slide that we used last year in 2024, and you could tell that there was obviously a very high jump between 2023 and 2024. For many years, particularly throughout COVID, we saw relatively flat demand from 2016 to effectively 2022. We saw that bump up in 2023 and then a substantial increase in 2024. And many of those drivers are ones that we're now talking about today. Of course, we're talking about artificial intelligence, data centers, electric vehicle penetration, electrification of homes and businesses. And this is all creating forecasted demand for energy. And you can see these demand projections are pulled forward for about 15 years into the future. And every year in January, we create a new trend line here. And so as we transition to this next slide, you'll see what 2025 looks like. This is the same exact chart that we just saw a moment ago, but you can see that the delta between 23 and 24 is actually smaller than the change between 24 and 2025. This is obviously substantial. And as noted, this is the same exact chart that we just looked at, but it only plots the new 2025 line on it. So the scale on the y-axis has changed a bit, but we're fully expecting a load of about 225 gigawatts by 2040. In this next slide, you'll see some of the factors that we consider as when we conduct our load forecast. And this is a process that takes the better part of 6 months. We work very closely with our member utilities on the ground because they have the best information and knowledge of their service territories and businesses, homes, industrial customers that plan to develop in their service territories. But we also look at a number of other factors. We look at weather forecasts, both predicted in the future and retrospectively. We look back about 20 years. We look at changes in the economy, changes in the employment rate and sector. And obviously, when you have this level of introspection, it helps make the forecast more accurate. But of course, with any forecast like the weather forecast, there's going to be some degree of inaccuracy. The only question is how much will you be inaccurate by? So all of these bullets on these 4 lines are just a small sampling of the factors that the folks in our load forecasting department consider. But as noted, number 1 is the information and intelligence provided by our local distribution utilities on the ground that feed up into PJM's forecast. And we just issued our 2025 forecast the second to last Friday in January, if you'd like to see some details there. And it's fascinating because depending on the region, the driver could be different. It could be port electrification in one region, but data center development in another. In the next slide, we do make adjustments to the load forecasts. And we've heard recently some concerns about, is there a risk of double counting or triple counting? Is it possible that a data center developer may be looking into service territories, for example, in Dominion in Virginia, but you cross the river into Maryland and you're in the Potomac Edison service territory, and they may be shopping around. So we're working with the industry, we're working with large manufacturers to determine whether or not there is that potential for double accounting, and if so, we could reconcile our forecasts accordingly. But as I stated a moment ago, we hit a new record winter peak. This demand is real, it is increasing, and we'll continue to make any adjustments as we work with both customers and utilities on the PJM system. So we're going to step back just a bit, get a broader view of the type of generation that is currently operating in PJM. And here in this slide, you'll see we have about 180 gigawatts of resources. Just under half of that are represented by our natural gas fleet, You have a little under 25% is coal, a little under 20% is nuclear, and then everything else includes the energy to waste facilities, all the renewables, our hydroelectric sources, as well as other thermal resources, coal, diesel, and a few others in there. But that's what we're looking like today. But what does the future look like? Here in this next slide, we see what is in the queue, and this is the future of our generating resource fleet. We currently have about 200 gigawatts of resources waiting in the queue to potentially interconnect with PJM. This number has been coming down quite a bit. You've heard about the clogged queues and the problems, and we'll discuss that in a bit. But as you can see from one pie chart to another, there's a high degree of contrast as to what today's fleet looks like of resources and what tomorrow's fleet. In many of our states, it's mostly solar is the predominant resource that is represented in each of the individual state queues. Storage paired with solar is number 2. So this is battery storage. There's a number of types of batteries. You have 4-hour lithium batteries. You have long duration storage. And you have a few other technologies that are more in their infancy. Third up is wind. And what don't you see in this queue? You don't see any nuclear. You don't see any coal. We have a few natural gas plants, and those are mostly represented in the West Virginia and the Ohio queues. And then we just have a little bit of hydroelectric. In this next slide, even though PJM is fuel neutral, and we do encourage the connection of any resource that would put new watts on our system, we have something called the ELCC ratings, and that stands for the effective load carrying capability. Effectively, we take a look at every potential resource, and we look at it at a day when demand is relatively high and supply is relatively tight. And we take a look at that resource and we determine how much can we expect to get from the resource on a particular stressed day. And if you look at these ratings, you'll see that the gold standard is set by our nuclear units at about 95%, which means that if we have a 1,000 megawatt nuke on the system, we could expect it to provide about 950 of those 1,000 megawatts. However, if you take a look at our poorest performing unit, that would be fixed solar on the third line there. It's only 9%. So effectively, if we have an equivalent 1,000 megawatt nameplate solar generating facility, we'd only expect about 90 megawatts of that 1,000 megawatts to be available to serve load on that peak day. So this is just a good scorecard. It changes several times a year, typically twice a year in advance of our auctions to provide our resources an understanding of where they are. And going forward, as we move forward, as we have more experience with a particular resource, that will go to inform these ratings, and these ratings will continue to change. In the next slide, we'll talk a moment about the interconnection reforms and the queue. The queue is effectively the line of applicants that wish to interconnect with the PJM grid. And starting back in about 2018, we saw the number of applications rise from about 300 to an all-time high of over 1,300 in 2021. So in a short 3-4 year period, we saw the number of applications effectively double every year, from 17 to 18, 18 to 19, and so on. So in 2021, when we hit our peak, we recognized there was a problem. We worked quickly with our stakeholders to develop a task force to figure out that situation, as represented in this blue and green box. We hatched an agreement with our stakeholders, and in April of 2022, the membership overwhelmingly agreed to some reforms to the queue process. We submitted that to our regulator, FERC, in June, and in November of 2022, in the pink box there, FERC approved the reforms, and we implemented them in July of 2023, and we've been off to the races ever since. Some of the reforms changed the way in which we process the queue. It used to be first come, first serve, but now it's first ready, first serve. We also required additional requirements when you filed your application with PJM, including security deposits and performance markers that you would have to make. We did discover that a fair number of the projects in our queue had a relatively low likelihood of actually getting built upon graduating, effectively graduating the queue and moving forward. Similar to some of our other fellow RTOs, oftentimes the success rate in terms of projects exiting the queue and being interconnected was sometimes as only high as about 15%. So we're hopeful that these reforms will actually make that percentage go up much, much higher once we see the full suite of reforms in place. This next slide shows you how much we've actually pushed through. So currently we have about 50 gigawatts of projects that have received all the necessary PJM approvals, but they're not yet constructed. And I can tell you, if we had those 50 gigawatts right now, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be in a much better position with those resources online. But they're not online, and many of them are struggling for a number of reasons: supply chain issues, lack of financing. But number one, far and above the others, is local and state siting and permitting issues. So they have everything in hand from PJM, but they can't get their local CPCNs, certificates of public convenience and necessities, or permits from the county level, the state level, the city level, to actually build the resource, whether it be a battery, solar array, or a wind turbine. In 2024, we pushed out about another 26 gigawatts. And in 2025 and 2026, so this year and next year, this is where the rubber hits the road. We're going to push out close to 200 gigawatts of resources. So by the end of next year, the queue will have been officially unclogged. And then going forward, we expect to process applications with a turnaround time of about 1 to 2 years in total. In this next slide here, you'll see just a snapshot of where some of your states fall. And these are projects that we're looking at either in 2024 or 2025. So last year or this year. You have some states that have a fair number of projects, such as Virginia and Indiana and Illinois. And then some smaller states like Delaware and Maryland that don't have a tremendous amount of projects in the queue. But this pie chart indicates it's just a snapshot of 2024 and 2025 projects, similar to the larger queue slide that we saw earlier, reflecting about 206 gigawatts. This smaller snapshot reflects 72 gigawatts. And again, it's mostly solar storage or solar paired with storage in that purple there. So moving off the queue, we'll transition to just a quick talk about the capacity markets in PJM. And you may have heard of the base residual auction that occurred last summer in June, the BRA. And the BRA had a lot of headlines because of the price that we cleared at. And the price was effectively 9 times higher than it was for the previous delivery year. And why did that happen? Predominantly, it was because of supply and demand. We saw a fair number of units retire or intend to retire before the delivery year. And we're seeing demand, when we create our supply and demand curves, we see demand increasing quite substantially. So when we ran the auction, this is a capacity auction for capacity 3 years forward, we effectively cleared all of the capacity that bid in. So everybody who bid in, with the exception of just a few megawatts, received capacity commitments for the 2025-2026 delivery year which begins June 1st of this year, so June 1st, 2025. And you'll see in the bottom left box there, just we had 2 zones of our 21 zones that separated from the rest of the RTO. They were not able to meet their reserve margins, and they both had some capacity constraints, which did not assist the situation. So instead of clearing at the RTO cap, they cleared at their respective zonal caps. And we have a graphic in the next slide that illustrates what the prices were. And you'll see, again, Baltimore Gas cleared at $466 a megawatt day. Dominion cleared at $444 a megawatt day. And the rest of the RTO cleared at $269, almost $270. But on the right side there, you'll see what a difference a year makes. 2024 was $29. 2025 it was $270. So of course there was quite an outcry, particularly from the load interests, elected officials. You may have heard that we entered into a settlement in principle with Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania with a proposal to create a price floor and price cap for the next 2 base residual auctions. But the bigger story, but aside from the 9 times price increase, you see the reserve margins at the bottom there. In 2024, bottom right, we needed 14.7%. And after we ran the auction, we ended up with about 20.5%. So that was about we had a 6% cushion on top of what we needed. But you can see when we ran the most recent auction, we effectively cleared it by the skin of our teeth, less than 1 point difference between our internal reserve margin of 17.8 and what we actually cleared, which is 18.5%. The next slide here just shows you what prices look like over the past 10 years. And as you can see, it's not unheard of that we had a price over $200. You can see going back to 2018 delivery year, it was over 200. But of course, this most recent base residual auction cleared at effectively $270. So that was a record high. So what are we doing to enhance the market and make some mitigations? Here are 3 examples of proposals that are currently sitting at FERC that we hope will blunt some of the impact. The first one in blue are capacity injection rights, and that's effectively allowing a departing or retiring generator to effectively transfer their rights to a new resource. Let's say a coal facility is retiring and a new battery wants to site at an electrically equivalent location, or maybe the same location as the coal station, and plug in. And that would save them the time of having to go through the queue. So that's one way to effectively skip the queue. That filing was made with FERC on January 31st as a Section 205 filing, and we hope to get a positive response from FERC. RRI is effectively, it's a really narrow proposal that we filed in December with FERC in order to allow 50 projects, 50 effectively shovel-ready projects with high capacity numbers to jump ahead into one of the current queues, which is transition cycle 2. There was some controversy when we discussed it amongst the stakeholders because obviously folks that have been standing in the queue for quite a while do not want to see other projects skip ahead. But because of the reliability concerns that we see and envision in the short and near term, we thought that this proposal was just and reasonable. So we filed that with FERC. We are expecting a decision from FERC tomorrow, February 11th, as to whether or not they will allow us to effectively take 50 projects and move them a little further along in the queue. And the last item, surplus interconnection service, is something that we, just one slide back on that last one on the orange block there, is another proposal. And this is one that we learned from one of our RTO brethren, MISO, and Bob might touch on this in his presentation. We determined that we were being too conservative in reserving some of these excess transmission capacity. So we determined that if it's possible to allow existing generators to share some of this capacity when it's not being used, we will allow them to effectively double up. And that's another process and proposal that's currently pending at FERC. So together, we think that these three proposals with a few others I didn't mention will put us in a better position. So keep an eye on the news and see what FERC does in the very near term. This next slide, second to last slide, these are just a few resources that we publish in plain English. They're really meant to be read by the public. They're easy to read. We had one on Winter Storm Elliott last year. This middle report, which is affectionately known as the 4R report, Resource Retirements, Replacements, and Risks, has been, I think it's a bestseller in terms of taking a look at this situation that we're encountering and putting it into easy to understand terminology. This report was issued in February of 2023. We're currently working on an update to this report. It should be out in the coming weeks. And final slide that we have is just some policy takeaways that we like to share with our membership, and particularly those who are representing the states, whether they be state regulators, state energy officials, state consumer advocates. Three takeaways. Number one is that we would ask states to consider avoiding policies that would push off any resources until an equal and equivalent amount of resources are ready to join the system. While some of our states have policies that, sensible policies to move emitting resources off the grid, we don't want to move them off so quickly as we find ourselves in a situation where we don't have any resources to backfill. And as I noted on the ELCC chart, 1,000 megawatts of nuclear is not the same as 1,000 megawatts of solar. The second bullet I alluded to is that we're asking our states and local municipalities to look at any challenges that are obstructing the development of both transmission lines as well as generating resources, solar, wind, natural gas, batteries. We're having a lot of difficulty in many of our states building new resources quickly. It's not uncommon for a transmission proceeding to last over a decade before figuring out whether or not the developer can build it or not. And finally, we're all in this together. PJM does its best to maintain resource adequacy. That's our job, to maintain reliability on the system, of course, with our partners like Reliability First and CERC. But we're also asking states to assist with bringing on new resources. And they have tools, they have incentives, they have ways of also cutting the red tape to allow these resources to come on the system as soon as possible. And when we have a number of states in PJM that are just net energy importers, that's going to help us a lot. That will help us out a lot if some of our states could increase the numbers of their in-state generation. So thanks for your time and attention today. After my colleague Bob at MISO presents his view on the world, I think we'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Jason. That was fantastic. I was taking a lot of notes there. It made me a little slow on the slide progression, but I think it all worked out. We do have a number of questions that came in for you already through Slido. We can get through some of these, although we won't get through all of these right now. We can always answer some offline. So let me just throw a couple at you while we still have you here.
Sure.
So, okay, the first one is, are you concerned with the amount of storage that is currently on the system and being installed? ERCOT and California ISO seem to incentivize and implement a lot more storage. It seems that storage is needed since we keep adding more solar. What are your thoughts around battery storage that you're seeing coming through the queue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Texas and California, no question, are the leaders in battery storage development. Although you saw one of the largest battery in the world caught fire last month at Moss Landing, so that was a tragic situation. So the technology is still in development. States in PJM such as Maryland and Illinois are looking at incentivizing battery storage. But currently, let's take a look at the facts on the ground. We only have one 4-hour battery on PJM that's available as a energy and ancillary services resource, and that's down in Virginia. So even though there's a tremendous amount of storage in the queue, we don't have a lot of storage. We have one battery effectively on the grid at the moment, one large battery.
Great, thank you. We have two questions that came in that go hand in hand, so I'll kind of ask you these two together. So the first was, how does PJM determine the ELCC values that were shown? And where's the second question? Okay, and then the second question that came in right after that was, what effect did the changes to the capacity rating of simple cycle CTs have on the capacity shortfall, and should they be rolled back to 100% capacity value?
I don't think I understand the second question. With respect to the first question there, so there are folks that work on the ELCC valuations, and as I noted, they are revised typically set semi-annually in advance of our auctions. And some of the input that we get is based off of actual historical track record and the performance of these units. There are other injects that we consider in the ELCC development, but I do not know what they are. But if that person would like to contact me offline, I could get them a better response, along with the other question, which I can't answer.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. Okay, one more question, and then we'll move on to Bob. So with I think you had showed the price points. Was the BGE Dominion RTO price primarily due to Brandon Shore shutdown, or was it mostly due to load growth in the area?
So Brandon Shores obviously had an impact because they weren't planning to stick around for the next auction. So that was a factor in the BGE capacity price. No question there. With respect to Dominion, it's a bit of a different situation because Dominion was using the fixed resource requirement FRR at the time, so its customers were largely hedged from that I believe it was $466 price. But of course, Virginia, and particularly Northern Virginia, is experiencing extreme high demand growth because of the proliferation of data centers. It's been the global data center capital of the world, and the development has not stopped. So their distribution queues are actually getting quite long. I believe it's 6 years in length at this point. So we have a situation there. Virginia is a net energy importer at this point, similar to a number of other states that we have, including Maryland, New Jersey, District of Columbia, Delaware, Ohio, and a few others. So that was one reason why the Dominion zone separated.
Makes sense. Thanks so much.